Hi, my name's Justin Shelfon. I'm the engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a Premier Field Engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, I'm going to be talking about role-based administration and the different components involved in that, like security roles, security scopes, and collections, and how we tie that all together to actually define the permissions that we need. So with that said, I'll go ahead and jump right into this. So the first thing I want to talk about are those three key components. So the first one we'll look at is the security roles. So a security role is essentially granting the admin what feature area of Config Manager they have access to do, right? So that would be like, are they a full admin where they can pretty much do anything within the console? Are they an application administrator where they can only create, manage, and deploy applications? Are they a software update manager? So there's a lot of different built-in administrative roles that you can define within Config Manager, and you can also do things like creating custom roles as well, which we'll cover within this video. The next thing is going to be security scope. So for example, you have your security roles. Let's say that we gave a admin the application administrator security role. What that would do is give them access to do pretty much anything along the lines of managing and creating applications. Now, there's a lot of scenarios where you might have multiple departments and they might need to be able to both create applications, manage and deploy them, but you might not want to have Department A see Department B's applications. That's where security scopes come into play. So within the different objects that are scopable, which we can see a lot of the scopable objects here, it's essentially a way to say, hey, we want to create a scope for Department A and we want a different scope for Department B. So even though both of those admins can create and manage applications, they can only create and manage the applications within Department A's scope and within Department B's scope. Now, one thing to mention that not all objects in Config Manager are scopable. So here's a list of all the common ones that are scopable. So a lot of things are scopable, but there's also a couple things that are not scopable. Now, most of these non-scopable objects are things that you would usually only assign to a full administrator, but they are worth taking note. So these non-scopable objects, if a user had permissions within that, they could essentially see these objects, even if a different admin created them that is in a different scope. So for example, if Department A made a boundary and boundaries aren't scopable, that means Department B would also be able to see that boundary, assuming the admin in both of those departments had the security role permission to see boundaries. And then finally, we have collections. So essentially what that ties into, so for the different admin security roles, so let's say they're an application administrator and deployment manager, and within their scope, what can they actually target for those objects? So for the applications, software update groups, configuration baselines, packages, any different object that you have permissions to as an admin, you can basically limit what they can actually see from a device level and what they can target those different objects to. So that's how we can control Department A can only see Department A's computers, whereas Department B can only see B's and they can't see each other's. That's how collection comes into play with RBA. All right, so jumping over to my domain in Active Directory users and computers, I've got a few different scenarios that I have set up here that I'm going to walk through. So the first one's going to be probably the most basic and one that often you'll run into with different organizations where they might only care about scoping servers and workstations. So they don't want the workstation admins to be able to deploy or see any of the server objects, and the server admin shouldn't be able to see any of the workstation objects within the console. So that's quite common to see that one. So within both of these security groups, we do have a user. So we have a server admin and we have a workstation admin that are part of these security groups that correspond to it. And then next, what we have is we're simulating a university. And then within that university, we're saying there's two different departments. So we have a College of Finance and we have a College of Healthcare. And we'll walk through how we can split up permissions in that scenario as well, where you don't want the College of Finance SCCM admins to manage anything in the healthcare and vice versa. So jumping over to my console, the first scenario that we'll cover is the server and workstation scenario. So we'll do a very basic way of, let's say that you had a workstation admin and a server admin, and you wanted to essentially give them full access to Config Manager to do whatever they wanted, but you don't want them to be able to see the other people's objects. So for this scenario, we won't go very deep into security roles or security scopes. We'll leave that for the different scenarios for College of Finance and Healthcare. So we'll add a group here. We will add the server admin security group. We're going to say we want to give them access as a full administrator to SCCM. So be aware they could go and create boundaries and pretty much any admin action, but we're going to scope them down to the collection on only seeing servers. So for the collections here, we don't want them to see all systems. So we'll remove that. We'll remove our users and groups. And then we will add the collection here for all servers. So we can see we have 4 servers, and then we'll do OK, and then OK. All right. And what we'll do next, we'll repeat that process, but we'll do it for workstations. Okay. So we'll add this. We'll say they're full admin. We'll get rid of the all systems, and we'll get rid of the all users, and we'll say they can only manage the collection for all workstations. So that's currently 7 devices, and then we'll do OK. Now you can see that I left them both in as the default scope. So that means they will be able to see each other's objects. So things like applications, update groups, they could see what the other admins are creating there and deploy that to their collection for workstations or servers that they manage. So this is going to be a pretty basic scenario where you only want to limit the collection that these admins can manage. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to search out for my console. I'm going to open the option to run as a different user. Okay, here we go. So first I'll run the workstation admin. So we'll open that up. And what we're going to notice here, if we look at the actual workspaces, we can see that we pretty much have access to everything, right? So we have our assets and compliance, we have our software library, monitoring, and administration. So since I'm a full admin, I can essentially do anything that a full admin could do with the exception of my collection. So if I come and look at my devices, we can see even though I'm a full admin, I can only see 7 devices, right? And in the collections, I can only see the workstation collection or any collection limited to that. Now jumping back over to my full admin account, which has access to everything, if I look back at my devices, we can see that this account can see all 13 devices, right? So even though I'm a full admin, I can only do things as far as deployment goes against the collection that I manage as a workstation admin. So then jumping back to my console, if I do a run as, okay, and then do OK, what we're going to see here is the server admin can also do everything because we are a full admin for our security role, but now we can only see 4 devices. For the collections, we can only see the all servers collection or anything limited to that. Now, since we're a full admin, we of course have the ability to create a collection, but for the limiting, it could only be limited to the all servers, which is what we're scoped to as far as collections go. All right, so let's close out of my server and workstation console. Now that was the most basic scenario that you're probably going to have. So if you only have maybe one SCCM server admin and one workstation admin, and they both should be full administrators within Config Manager, but you just wanted to scope them to the collections of workstations and servers, that would be how we could do that. And that's pretty simple. Now, generally, if you're in a larger environment, you're probably going to get a lot more particular in like what collections you can manage as well as the scopes. And that's what we'll cover next. So what we'll cover here is going to be the scenario where, let's say you're a university and you want to split up the College of Finance SCCM admins and the College of Healthcare admins. Now, one thing that I did do, we do have an organizational unit that I'm using for this example. So we can see we have a department and then we have a finance OU. We can see we have one workstation and one server. And then we have a healthcare OU with one workstation and one server. Now within Config Manager, I did also create a collection. So we have a finance collection. If I look at the properties of that, all we're doing is we're using the system resource and then the system OU name for the collection query. So if I look at my criteria, I can just see that we're doing a system resource and then system OU name. So that's our discovery data. And we're saying is equal to, and then we're choosing our OU name. So I just clicked on the value tab and I basically selected my finance OU. Now I also did the same thing for the healthcare OU as well. So closing out of this, we can see that if I open my finance, I can see my one workstation, Windows 7 64-bit, and then my MDT server. And then for the healthcare, I have my 32-bit Windows 7 device, and then a MBAM server. So for this scenario, these are going to be the collections that we are scoping our different admins to. So we have our finance and we have our healthcare. Now, coming back into my administrative users, what we'll do here is go ahead and start with our finance security group. So we'll add this here. We'll do finance. Now, the way that we'll start this, we're going to start with the least amount of permissions first, and we'll kind of go through how we can analyze what permissions you might need. So let's say for this finance group, initially, we're just going to make this group remote tools operator. So that would allow them to see their devices and right click and do remote tools. So that looks good. We'll do OK. Now for this, just like our other ones, we're going to delete the all users collection and we're going to delete the all systems collection. And we're only going to allow them to see the finance collection. So that's going to be the two devices we have here. Okay. Now for the scope, let's say that we don't want our finance group and our healthcare group to see different objects that they create. So if they had the ability to create applications, we wouldn't want them to be able to see each other's objects for those applications. So we're going to delete that default scope, and I'm going to click on security scope. And what we're going to do here is create a new scope and call it finance scope. Okay. And then we'll do OK on that. We'll assign that scope and then do OK on that. Okay, that looks good. Now, the next thing we'll do is basically repeat that process, but we'll do that for our healthcare. Okay, so we'll do add. We're going to give it the same remote tools operator. So that's one of the least permissions that we can start with unless we do a custom role. So we can go through and see how we can increase the security roles to what you might need in your environment. So we'll get rid of all these default ones. We'll do collection here, and this one's going to be our healthcare collection that we're limiting them to. We're also coming to our scopes, and we will create a new scope and call it healthcare scope. And then we'll do OK. Now, one thing that I forgot here, let's go ahead and create something called a global scope. Okay, so we'll do global here, and then we'll do OK on that. Now, what I'm also going to do is go back to my finance admins, and I'm going to give them permissions to that global scope. Okay, so we'll come here, we'll add a scope. and then global. Now, the reason I'm adding the global scope is, let's say that there's enterprise applications that are available for everybody within your environment. So common things like maybe your PDF readers, your run times, things like that. What we'll do is we'll make a scope for that where we can put those default objects from our admin level and assign that to all our sub administrative users, so they can also see those objects, so they wouldn't have to go and duplicate those common enterprise applications or objects. All right, so coming back to my config manager console, we'll go ahead and do a run as. If we can get that, there we go. And what we'll do is we'll launch our finance admin first. So if we come here and open this, all right, there we go. So we'll launch this up. Now, since we're only a remote tools operator for our security role, we can see that we're scoped down quite a bit. So in assets and compliance, we only see users, devices, user, and device collections. For our different workspaces, we only see the assets and compliance and the monitoring workspace. So we're quite limited compared to what you would normally expect if you've been a full admin and config manager. So it will automatically not show different things within the console if our security role does not allow them to do those things. So looking over at my devices, now we can see that we only see the 2 finance devices that we have here. That's because we limited them to that collection. So if we look at our collections, we can see that we only see our finance collection here. Now you can also notice, since we're only a remote tools user, the only action that we're really going to get are some of these right-click actions on the device. So we could do things like remote control, remote assistance, and remote desktop. Now, coming back to our collections, you can also see that we don't have any right-click action to create a device collection, or we don't have the action here up at top to create the collection. So looking back up to my full admin, obviously we could come in here, look at our collections, and we could create a device collection or do all kinds of different things. So this is looking good as far as the way that we've scoped these down. Now, let's say that we wanted to give this user the ability to also manage applications. So if I come back into my admin session, come back to my users, and we look at our finance, we'll do properties of that, security roles. Now, if it was just as simple as I wanted them to have the ability to create and deploy applications, I could give them the app administrator. If we only wanted them to create, they could be an app author. And if we only wanted them to deploy, they could just be a deployment manager. But let's say I want this user to be able to do both for my finance admins as an administrator. So if I come back into my scope here and do a refresh, we can notice that we don't see any changes in our console, because this was something that would require us to reload here. Actually, it looks like I closed out my admin session too. So let me get that back open, and then we'll go ahead and do another run as. Okay, so we'll do our finance admin and we'll log back in. Now, since we gave the application administrator, we should now see that we have the software library node. So coming back over here, we can now see that we can see applications, and we could come in here and create an application. Now let's just walk through a basic application. So SCCM sources. Oh, I don't think I gave permissions to this user for that. All right, so I just went in and gave my finance admin permissions to my sources folder where I keep my applications. So what we'll do, we'll quickly come in here and we will create an application for 7-zip. So we'll just walk through that wizard and just do all the defaults here. All right, so there we go. So we will see that we do have the ability to create that application. So that looks good. We also have the option to deploy it, because our application administrator role also gave us the ability to deploy applications. So if we did go through the deploy, we will notice that we're only going to see that finance collection or any collection that we created that is limited to the finance. So that looks good. Now let's jump back as my full administrator. So jumping back over here. Now let's say that we had some applications here that we just wanted to make available to all our users. Now in this example, what I can see is we have two 7-zips. So one of them are going to be the one that was created by our finance admin. So if I come in here and look at the created by, I can see that this was my finance admin. Now let's say that I wanted to give some applications and make them available for all the different administrative users and groups that I define here. So what we'll do, we'll say the Adobe Reader and the Flash Player applications, we're going to define them and give them the global scope. So this would allow our finance admins as well as our healthcare admins to see all those applications. So if we jump back over, we can see here that if we look at our console and refresh, we can now see that the finance admin sees these 3 applications because they're now in that global scope that we defined. All right, so now let's go back over to my full admin session. So before we launch our healthcare admin session, let's go ahead and go back to my security, my administrative users, and let's give those healthcare admins, let's go ahead and make them an application administrator as well. And then okay. So now if I come back to my console and we do a run as different user, we'll go ahead and run as my healthcare admin. And what we'll see as far as permissions, we should be quite similar to what we see in here with regards to applications and creating applications. But we'll notice our devices are totally different. So we're only going to see the devices that are in the healthcare collection. And if we look at our collections, we're only going to see that healthcare collection. And if we were to create a collection, so we can now create collections because the application administrator does have the ability to make collections. But just like finance, we could only limit the collections that we create to the healthcare collection that we are limited to. But looking over at our applications, we're going to see that we see the 3 applications that we defined right here. But let's go ahead and look at our scopes. So there we go. So I must have also included that 7-zip application when okay, so I must have also included that in my selection when I created that. So if we look back over here when we created it, so looking back, if we look at scopes, since the finance admins that created this was also part of the global scope, it also scoped it to that as well. So since I created this under my finance, let's say I didn't want to also include this application I created to the global scope that other people are also a part of. So as the finance admin, I can come in here and say, I don't want this to be in this scope by default. This was also one of the options in the application creation wizard. You could have also deleted that scope there. So if we come back over to my healthcare admin and do a quick refresh, we can now see that they don't see that 7-zip application that was created by the finance admin. So that's really where the scope came into play. Now let's go ahead and close out of my finance admin and out of my healthcare admin. And let's say that we also want, so we'll come back in here and come to our finance group and security roles. And let's say we want to make this an infrastructure admin for our finance and healthcare, just to show a few different things with scopes. So we'll make this a infrastructure admin. And I believe this role will give us permissions to do boundaries. So let's come back over here into our console. We'll come back and run as a different user. We will run this as the healthcare admin and then okay. Now the infrastructure admin is going to give us quite a few more objects that we should see here. So under hierarchy, under boundaries, we'll go ahead and create a new boundary. So I'll just fill in some, let's call this healthcare boundary. Okay. And I'll just fill in just some data here just to create. I'm not really too worried about what that is. But one thing that you can see here, since this is not a scopable object, we don't have the ability to scope this down. So for example, if you had we'll come back in here, we'll run as a different user, and we'll run this as the finance admins. So go ahead and open that up. So if you had different administrative groups or users that had infrastructure rights for doing things like boundaries, just be aware that if they had those rights, there are going to be objects that aren't scopable. So for example, the finance admin can see the healthcare boundary because that's not a scopable object. All right, so that looks good. Let me close out of those two and open up my full admin. Now let's come back into these two different groups that we've added, and let's basically strip everything out. So we're not going to have any security roles for them. Oh, looks like I can't do that. Let's see. We'll just bring them back down to the remote tool, since that's going to be one of the least permissions for the default roles. We'll do the same thing here for the healthcare, and then okay, and then okay. All right, so jumping back over to the security roles. Now, we do have the ability to copy different roles. So let's say that you thought that the application administrator could be a good role to start off your template under. So we'll call this custom app admin. So what that will do when we copy the existing security role, it's going to give us all the existing permissions within that security role. So for example, we can see that the admin is going to give you permissions to alerts, app configuration policies, boundaries you can read as an app administrator. But this could be helpful. Let's say as an app admin, you wanted to use that as a template, but let's say you didn't want your admins for apps to be able to see boundaries. So that's where we could duplicate one of the built-in templates and create different options for them. So we don't want them to see boundaries. We don't want them to see boundary groups. So it can be a good way to not have to go and manually start and go through every single one of these if you know that you have something that you wanted to start from to be similar or like, but you just might have a few different attributes that you want to change around. So that's how we could go and duplicate it from an existing template. But one thing I do want to show you is how we can create it using RBAViewer. So RBAViewer, it's a tool that's built into the installation of Current Branch. It was relatively recent. It might have been 1802 or possibly 1806. But within your install folder of Config Manager in the tools and server tools, RBAViewer is now built in there. Now, if you're not on that yet, I will include a link within the video description as well, where you can go and download the standalone version of this in the toolkit. All right, so we will go ahead and run this. All right, so what RBAViewer is, it's essentially a tool that allows you to simulate different permissions and kind of analyze what the console would look like if you gave the user these permissions, and it also allows us to export this and import it into the console. So by default here, RBAViewer will set the default view to be a full administrator. So we're going to go ahead and uncheck that and then determine what we want to do as far as creating it. So you could either come in here and start adding different permissions to all these different objects that we can control. So for example, we could say application. Generally, that can be kind of complex trying to go individually. So usually what I would start with is the remote tools operator. So that's going to give us some of the core permissions that we would need in order to actually connect to the site. So we'll do OK on that and then analyze. And that's going to be a pretty minimal place to start. So remote tools operator would basically give us the ability to see devices. Within those devices, if we were to click on the device actions, that would basically allow us to start and then the remote operations here that we saw earlier. So that can be a good place to start. Now, let's say that you wanted to go through and just kind of define some custom actions that you wanted them to perform. So for example, we can see that the default remote tools operator does not have the ability to install client. So to install client, this is going to be an action on the collection level, and we need to be able to modify resource. That's going to allow us to install the client. So if I go and click reanalyze, that's going to reload the console here. So if I go back to my devices, click on a device and then click on the device actions here, we can now see that RBAViewer is telling us now that we have the modify resource, the install client option would now be available to us. One thing we can see is we don't have delete though. So let's say we also wanted to give this role permissions to delete. So coming back into the collection, the delete is going to be an option that we need in order to delete devices. So if we click on delete, that's going to allow us to delete collections, and delete resource would allow us to delete devices. So let's start there. Let's say we only want to delete resource, analyze this again, come back to our devices, click on a device, click on that query, and we can now see that we could delete the device. So let's jump over to our collections, look at the collection actions. We can see that we can't delete collections though under this current permission level. So let's say that we wanted to give this action under a collection to delete collections. So we'll go ahead and click analyze, come back to one of these collections, look at the actions we now have, and we can now see that, hey, we could now delete a collection with what we're giving this user. Let's say we want to also give it the modify and create. So we'll click analyze, come back to our collections, look at a collection, and then the properties here. We can now see that we have the modify. We could copy a collection, and under the collection, we also have the create collection. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's come up to the applications, and let's say that we want to give them the ability to read applications. So we'll go ahead and click analyze, and we can now see the software library workspace is now showing up. If we look back at our applications, we can now see that we could read applications. We're not going to have any ability to do much as far as modification or deployment goes because we don't have that action. Okay, so let's say we want to allow them to create, delete, modify collections, and let's say we want to allow them to, under the collection level, to also deploy applications. So we'll come here, we'll reanalyze this, and then if we look at the application here, we can now see we can create an application. Under the deployment, we can now see we can deploy an application, and we're going to also be able to do different attributes now that we could modify the application. So that's looking pretty good. So under distribution point, now you also have the ability to do different distribution points. So can they distribute content, for example? So just a lot of different actions. If you really wanted to get pretty specific as far as coming in here and kind of helping you analyze different options and what that would actually translate to in the console, RBAViewer can be a really good place to start. So let's say we also wanted this administrator be able to read boundaries. So if we come in here, read, boundary group, read. Now I don't see the administrator workspace showing up quite yet. There might be some permissions on the site level that we need in order for that to show up. Let's see. Not yet. Let's see. Yeah, sometimes RBAViewer can be a little bit finicky. I would have expected that read on the boundary would have probably brought up the admin workspace, but there may be some additional attributes in order to actually show that I might have not given, at least in this current permission level that I've got. So let's say we wanted to start here. We think that this would be a good security role to give our users for this group. So what we can do is go ahead and export this to an XML file. And what I'll do is call this the College of Finance Admins and export this out to my desktop. Now what we can do under the security roles in Config Manager, we can go ahead and import XML files. So I'm going to go ahead and import that custom policy that I have. And then we'll come back under my admin users and we'll do the finance admins group that we added. And we'll go ahead and remove the remote tools that we gave them. And now we're going to add that custom one for the College of Finance that we created through RBAViewer. So we'll do OK on that. We'll come back to our console and we'll do a run as. And we're going to go ahead and run this as our finance admin. Okay. And what we're going to see now is that we're only going to see some of these actions that we defined in that role. So under devices, we're still going to be limited to our collection, but now we can do things like install client, we can do remote tools, we can delete the device. If we look at our applications, we're still going to be able to see the applications. We can still see the one that we created that's within our scope. We can see the ones in the global scope, and we could still create applications and modify applications because we added that within our role. Now, I think that pretty much covers most of the core things that you need to know. So at this point, it would really be determining what security role or permissions, and you can of course use RBAViewer to really determine what you need each of your different admin groups to do. So would a default role work, like the app administrator, the remote tools? Some of those can be great places to start and might work just fine for what you need. But if you did have some really specific things, you could either duplicate one of the default security roles, or you could come into RBAViewer to kind of analyze, as you're making different changes, what the console would look like when you're doing that. And then of course we have our collection. So that's going to be for each of those different security or different groups or users that we add as an admin here in SCCM. What are we actually limiting them to? So should they only be seeing a finance collection or a workstation collection? So that's where the collections come into play. And then for each of those things they can manage, so are they an application administrator? Can they manage software update groups? That's where the scopes are going to come into play. So should they be able to see this other admin's applications or things within those scopable objects? So I hope this was helpful for you, and thank you for watching.